This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime tonight. Corruption in Congress. From a congressman. Congressman Ken Buck, Republican of Colorado, serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the Committee on Rules. He worked his way through high school, college, and law school as a janitor, truck driver, furniture mover, and ranch hand. After law school, Ken worked for Dick Cheney on the Iran-Contra investigation and then became a prosecutor with the U.S. Department of Justice, also serving as a district attorney in Colorado, also a business executive for a construction firm. His new book attacks business as usual in Washington, even attacking GOP business as usual. That book, Drain the Swamp, How Washington Corruption is Worse Than You Think. Welcome, Congressman. Honor to have you.
Thank you. It's great being with you.
The book is a gutsy indictment of Washington, particularly for someone who's now an insider. Let me just ask you first, the Freedom Caucus was instrumental in blocking of the Obamacare repeal and replace it. You know, there's some folks that feel that the Freedom Caucus is too rigid. You know, they'll drive the bus right off the cliff. President Reagan might have said, get me 80% and I'll come back for more. Is that a misperception about the Freedom Caucus?
It absolutely is. I have to tell you, the bus is going off the cliff, and if we don't slam the brakes on right now, we're over the cliff. And so with $20 trillion of debt, it's hardly the Freedom Caucus's fault that we are in the position that we're in. But I think that the Freedom Caucus is very clear that we are all in favor of responsible programs, but we cannot have the federal government continue to run health care in America.
The bill itself, which the estimates were 24 million people would lose their health care or choose not to have it and might shred the safety net, cap Medicare spending. Was it a bad bill in and of itself that way, or did it not go far enough in your view?
I think we're going to see an improved bill that comes to the floor. The key from my perspective is that we return as much authority to the states to regulate the system. Mm-hmm. Each state in America is different, has different needs, and is able to spend a different percentage of its budget on health care. And I think it's important that the federal government get out of the way and allow states to make that determination. Some states will want a work requirement for Medicaid, and other states won't. And that's really up to the state to make that decision. But the state's going to have to balance the needs of transportation and K through 12 education and health care and others before they are able to make that determination. I think that the mistake we make is the one-size-fits-all plan from Washington, D.C. just doesn't fit everybody.
You said in the book, which I thought was a great point, that you wanted to see open debate on this, which there wasn't when Obamacare was jammed through the system. But then it ended up seeming like Speaker Ryan did exactly that. Are you critical of that?
I think that there's a misperception that this bill is the only health care debate that's going to occur. This is really the first step. And we will see a second step that the administration, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, will go through. And I think we'll see other bills and other debates and various oversight hearings on health care. So I think there will be more of an open process than we've seen so far. But because there will be no Democrat support for this bill in the House or Senate, we have to use budget reconciliation, and it's a very limiting way to try to pass legislation.
Okay. So hopefully tort reform, negotiating drug prices, crossing state lines, health savings accounts, all of that stuff will get addressed at some point. Now, you talk about this corruption being worse than we think. Tell us exactly what you mean.
Well, one of the things that I found when I first got to Congress was that there are dues for committees. So if you want to be on an A committee like the Appropriations Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, there's $450,000 of dues that you have to pay to the National Republican Congressional Committee, and the Democrats have the same structure on their side. So what happens is members oftentimes will hold receptions in Washington, D.C., invite lobbyists. Those lobbyists will write a check to the National Republican Congressional Committee, and then the member owes the lobbyist. There is a corrupting influence in that whole process. If you want to be a chairman of one of those committees, it costs $1.2 million. So it is really a pay-for-play system that I think it's bad optics, two, it's bad politics, and three, it's bad policy. I think we should change that. So I've written a letter to the Ethics Committee asking them to make it unethical for anyone to consider fundraising in the promotion to an A committee or to chairman.
I think that stuff stunned me. I knew nothing about it. How about 1/3 of discretionary funding is unauthorized? What do you mean by that?
What I mean is, and I use the example in the book of the Endangered Species Act. We have an act that was passed in 1973. It had a 5-year sunset on it. If Congress did nothing else, the act would expire after 5 years. So members voted for it, thinking, we'll see what happens, and if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, it'll expire, won't require another vote. It was reauthorized once with another 5-year sunset, and has not been reauthorized since. So since 1984, the Endangered Species Act has not been reauthorized. It has received appropriations every single year. It has received funding every single year. So 1/3, $500 billion of our discretionary budget is unauthorized, programs that should have sunset. Some of them are good programs. Some of them are absolutely necessary. But if Congress doesn't do its oversight and make sure that the programs are effective and efficient, then we have failed. And I think that's it would be a good policy just to say, do your oversight, or these programs don't get appropriations.
In fact, the whole budgeting process, as you describe it, is kind of phony. These omnibus bills bypass essentially any oversight in the subcommittees, and the thing called the chairman's mark allows them basically to control what the budget is. There's $500 billion of user fees and fines that nobody knows where they go or anything. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the last point that you make, I think, is a great point. When you go to a national park and you pay a fee to enter the national park, that fee doesn't necessarily go to the U.S. Treasury. Oftentimes, these fees and fines that agencies impose on private businesses and citizens will go into an agency account, and the agency then uses that money as it deems appropriate, and it doesn't have any oversight by Congress. Congress is supposed to, under the Constitution, have the power of the purse. If agencies are bypassing Congress by creating these separate accounts, then Congress has no authority over that agency.
Talking about lack of oversight, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Congress has no control over its purse strings, and it is tended to go after big targets that can pay big fines as opposed to maybe who's behaving the worst. Do you have any comments on the CFPB?
Yeah, I do. I think it needs to be reformed. We certainly want to have a financial watchdog in the federal government and in state governments, but we don't want to have an out-of-control financial watchdog, and that's what the CFPB has become. The funding source is the Fed, and there is no oversight. The president appoints, but Congress doesn't confirm the director of the CFPB. So it really is a challenge to figure out how to bring that agency under control without the 60 votes in the Senate. But it's an absolutely necessary step to have more control over any agency in government.
We got about a minute to go in this segment. Is the Ex-Im Bank an example of crony capitalism that's supposed to be benefiting small business but really benefiting actually even a very few number of big businesses?
It absolutely is. The Ex-Im Bank is benefiting Boeing and General Electric and Caterpillar and a few large corporations, but it advertises itself as helping small business. But the taxpayers are on the line, just like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. If the loans go bad, the taxpayers have to pay, and that's a serious problem, and it's a problem we have to deal with and deal with it quickly. I think we need a convention of the states. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, there are two ways of amending the Constitution. One, the method that we have used so far in our country's history, where language is proposed and passed by 2/3 of each House of Congress. It then goes to the states, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify that language. The other method that hasn't been used, but I think has to be used in this case, is that the states demand that Congress convene a convention of the states, and that the language is created at that convention, and then 3/4 of the states need to ratify that language. And I think the only way we get a balanced budget amendment passed, and the only way we get term limits passed, is by doing it through that method. I don't think that Congress will ever limit its own ability to spend money or the terms that members serve.
Do you think we have $20 trillion of debt, over $90 trillion of unfunded, if you include health care and Social Security? Do those numbers have to be attacked downward, or we just got to stop adding to it?
Well, I think if we stop adding to it, it's a good first step. The challenge really is how to balance in the long run. We're not going to balance next year. It would be such a shift in our economy that it would cause great disruption. Yep. But we can balance in 10, 12 years, and by balancing over time, pay off that debt. The debt is a larger and larger portion of the budget, and it's going to squeeze out many of the essential programs that are in the budget right now.
Okay, how about getting rid of big money? There's a stat in your book that amazed me, that the lobbying spending is about $6 billion, and it yields $4 trillion of benefits in various different ways. How do we get rid of big money?
That's a pretty good investment, isn't it? Wouldn't you
like
that's
a great investment.
Have that rate of return for your investments?
Yeah.
It's a good question. We have a very well-defined First Amendment right in being able to donate money to candidates. I think there are two basic kinds of donations. One is an ideological donation, and the other is a transactional donation. On ideological donations, people donate money to Ken Buck for Congress because I stand up for their Second Amendment rights, or I believe in smaller government and lower taxes. And so they see those values, they see my voting record, and they support me for those principles that I hold. The other kind of donation, the transactional donation, is I will give you this money if you will vote this way on a bill. Or you vote a particular way on a bill, and then you receive a donation. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of donation I think that people find offensive, and we need to make sure that we reduce that. And there are a number of ways we can do that. The donations to certain committees go up dramatically around the time those committees examine major pieces of legislation. For example, the Transportation Committee members received large donations right before the transportation bill was reviewed in committee. Those are the kinds of things that I think we have to look at and say, maybe you can't donate to anybody from in that committee for a period of 6 months or a year when they're considering a piece of legislation like that. But there can be reforms that minimize transactional giving.
Good ideas. Now, you said in the book that the House is only in session 111 days a year, which is pretty amazing. Talk about how you would change that, and what do you mean by restoring regular order?
So I think that the House needs to meet more, and I think one of the things we could do is to meet, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that people don't work when they're not in session in D.C. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of work that gets done in districts, and it's very important work. But when we're in D.C., I think that meeting from Monday morning to Friday night, maybe even having a floor time on Saturday, so that members have to stay in their in D.C. for a weekend or two a month would be beneficial. One of the ways that things get done, good things get done in D.C. is personal relationships are built and trust is created. And when everybody is flying home as soon as they can to get to their districts and meet with their constituents, which is important, some of that is taken away. So I think it would be beneficial to try to work a few weeks of the month where we're actually not just flying in on a Monday and flying out on a Friday, but actually working the full day.
You call for the inspectors general, which are currently in the cabinets, in the departments themselves, to report to Congress.
I do, and I think that's important. Right now, the inspector generals are appointed by the president, by the administration. They're supposed to be examining. They work under the same roof as the department that they are examining, which in some cases is good, in some cases bad. Their budgets are decided by the departments that they work for, and I think the Congress should not accept the recommendations of those departments, but rather do the funding. And then I think the inspector generals should report directly to Congress and not to the department heads that they report to.
You talk about what people can do. One of them is electing candidates of good character. How does that happen?
Well, it happens by individuals really getting involved in the campaign process, volunteering for a campaign, attending rallies, doing your best to learn what drives an individual to run for office. And if we have people of good character in Congress, the chances of them wanting to stay in the swamp too long or wanting to treat the swamp like a hot tub is a lot less. And so I would really encourage American citizens to closely examine those who are running for office. I know people are busy. They're raising families. They're working very hard. But if we get this wrong, our ability to dig out of this hole is going to be very hard.
Are you catching grief or anything for this book? I mean, you're an insider now, and you're critical of the leadership on both sides and on the culture and on the swamp. Are you taking a beating at all, or are people saying, boy, it's good to get this stuff coming out?
Well, I tell you, I didn't have any friends when I got to D.C. I'm not going to have any friends when I leave, and I am really convinced that my role in Washington, D.C. is to expose the corruption and to do my very best to fix this problem. I think if we have a better institution, we will have better results. Are
you term limiting yourself or anything?
I have not term limited myself, but I can tell you, given my friendships or lack of friendships, and given my desire to change the system, I'm not planning on spending a lot of years in D.C. But I think when people term limit themselves, the people who are in favor of term limits leave, and the people who are opposed to term limits stay. And so it is a self-defeating process. Are
you optimistic that Speaker Ryan is going to do the right things over time?
I am. I think Paul Ryan's a great man. I really do. I've had the chance to get to know him, and he is incredibly bright, incredibly principled, and he is right now in a broken system, and I hope he will help fix the system and really help get the incentive structure changed, and that's what I think is so important.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Congressman Ken Buck. Coming next, Ron Rubin, former enforcement attorney with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, about the tragic fall in his mind of the CFPB. This is Jim Campbell, host of Forensic Talk. Tune into this station on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. for deep dives into the biggest crime stories today. Unsolved murders, financial crimes, penetrating questions.
I'm John Iannuzzi, producer of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Each week, you'll hear in-depth interviews, whether it's Bobby Kennedy Jr. on his claims his cousin Michael Skakel is innocent of the Moxley murder, or a brutally honest conversation with Kathleen Willey, one of the women alleging sexual assault in the Clinton Oval Office, or the first interview after prison with an insider trader from the Raj Rajaratnam biggest insider trading scandal in Wall Street history.
That's Monday night at 6 p.m. We'll bring you the facts, the forensic, both sides of the story, from insider trading to crimes of passion.
Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell is brought to you by Park City Productions. Like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow us on Instagram. That's Park City Productions 06604.
This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, 1490 WGCH. Now we're going to bring in former enforcement attorney for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Ron Rubin. And he's got a lot of amazing stuff about what he calls the tragedy of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Thanks. Good to be here.
What you've written is obviously a gutsy sort of inside, almost whistleblower account. Before we dive into that, give folks who may not know exactly what the Dodd-Frank Consumer Financial Protection Bureau even is.
Well, the Dodd-Frank Act was passed. It was a much longer piece of legislation passed after the financial crisis to address a lot of issues, and about a quarter of the law was creating this new agency that was just dedicated to enforcing consumer financial laws that, in a lot of cases, other agencies used to enforce.
And basically, in layman's terms, things like revealing the fine print in a lot of products or mortgage or stuff that may look incomprehensible, simplify credit disclosures. Is that correct?
Yes. The original, Elizabeth Warren in 2007 published now kind of a legendary article calling for an agency that would make sure that people understood their financial decisions. So when you're taking a mortgage, that you understand what it is, payday loans, car loans. That was really the entire proposal. But what it ended up being was discrimination laws, mortgage laws, debt collection laws, and altogether there's 18 or 19 statutes that they enforce. So it ended up being much, much broader than the original intention. So what you described was correct, but as it turned out, was only a small part of what they now do.
Now, before we dive into it, did the idealism was it of an agency like this? Was it destroyed by the swamp?
That's a pretty good final wrap up. I mean, one of the points that I make in the article was that structuring it this way almost guaranteed that it would end up being a political organization instead of a professional organization. When I came to Washington to help build this, I thought that basically we were building a similar version of the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I had previously worked earlier in my career for 7 years. But it ended up, and at this moment I would say it still is, much more of a political agency than it is a professional agency.
So the structure is very unusual and puts the director particularly in a hugely powerful position. He's appointed and funded independently of Congress, right? Yes.
Well, he's appointed by the president and has to be confirmed by the Senate. So unlike other agencies, which is what there was a recent case, which you'll probably ask about later, this is one of those rare cases where it's an independent agency that's not headed by a commission. It's headed by one single director who's appointed by the president. And once he is appointed, even the president can't remove him, except for cause, for if the inefficiency, neglect, and malfeasance in office.
Makes him one of the most powerful people in Washington, right?
Right. And then the other, and then what's kind of the icing on the cake is the other way that Congress, if they're from the other party or doesn't like the, agency or at least wants to control the agency, they can cut their funding. And so what they did was they funded it through the Federal Reserve, which is a bank, and earns its own profits and doesn't get money from Congress. So basically Congress can't cut their budget, which is how they might rein in another, an agency that they didn't like. So it's between those two factors, they really answer to almost nobody.
Sounds like Senator Warren's pretty smart. Whoever was behind that structure. All right, what I want to do, I think, would be a good place to start because everybody knows about this. Wells Fargo just had a huge scandal. 2 million unauthorized bank and credit card accounts were opened without the customers knowing that. That would seem like a classic CFPB case. What was their role in it?
It looked like that at first, and the way it rolled out, which, by this point with the CFPB, they're still so focused on everything is the headline and, what's it going to look like. And so if there was that kind of fraud was exactly what the Bureau was formed to stop. But what in fact happened was for 2 years they were going into the bank with their examiners, looking at everything, and if anybody noticed it, and as far as I know from the examiners I've talked to, nobody really seemed to catch it. But if they did, they didn't think it was worth addressing. And then at the end of 2013, the Los Angeles Times ran a a big article expose, and it caught their attention because some of the employees who felt they were fired because they were not opening enough accounts sued Wells Fargo. And so when the lawsuit came out, and I guess one of the people, the plaintiffs, called the newspapers, somehow that got to them, and they did a very lengthy, in-depth article. Now, at that point, you would think, okay, well, the CFPB definitely knows about it now. They're going to stop it. But in fact, they let the Comptroller of the Currency and the Los Angeles City Attorney lead the investigations, and the CFPB went off and did something else, and whatever else they were doing. And after about 3 years, when it was all over, they came in, and because the Dodd-Frank law gives them so much more leverage to assign penalties, they negotiated the largest penalty of the three of them. So theirs was $100 million. The city attorney, I think, was $50, and comptroller was $35 million. And so the news stories rolled out, and the lead story was Consumer Financial Protection Bureau protects consumers, stops this fraud. But in fact, they really just came in at the end and negotiated the biggest fine. And not only that, but the $100 million didn't go to consumers. The $100 million went to the CFPB or the Treasury, or whatever penalty monies goes to the Bureau.
Yeah, that stunned me. Only $5 million went to consumers?
I think less than $5 million. Probably $2 or $3 million. Now, the reason, perhaps, if you want to try to, I'm not defending them, but if you want to kind of explain the way that played out, was that a lot of the accounts were opened and closed, and the consumers never knew it. And it's a little bit hard to say, well, what was actually the harm, the financial harm? I mean, obviously, it's just generally terrible. People should not be able to open accounts in your name. But the question was, what was the quantifiable harm to consumers? And the real harm would be if you went out to get a mortgage, and because you had opened other credit card accounts or bank accounts or whatever, your credit score went down.
Yeah. And
you would end up paying a higher mortgage interest rate on your mortgage for many, many years to come. So the harm was probably much more than the $2 or $3 million that they calculated.
Yeah, I would think they would be liable, able to get civil damages like that for really what's fraudulent abuse. But your main point, though, is that while this should have been at the heart of the CFPB mission, they really basically just came in at the end and took the credit.
Right. And
the money.
Well, and the theory is, and if you want to say, well, you're protecting consumers, you're saying, okay, well, this huge fine will stop banks from doing this in the future. And if you saw the way it played out, you have to, first of all, keep in mind, $100 million is a lot of money to the average person, but to Wells Fargo, it'll make 1 quarter's profits not look so good. It won't destroy the $100 million in and of itself won't destroy the bank. And
no, for instance, J.P. Morgan paid $30 billion in mortgage, from the mortgage scandal.
Right. Right. I mean, and if you just literally look at it as, okay, well, that's $100 million less profits in 1 quarter, but the stock price was totally destroyed because basically a lot of people lost faith in the bank and, were saying, well, should I keep my money in Wells Fargo anymore? And then on top of that, the head of the bank came in and didn't convince Congress and didn't basically stop the bleeding. And so he got fired. And between him and the woman who was running the incentive programs, they had to give back $60 million. That's what will make the next bank executive make sure he's careful.
Now, you have a bunch of specific sort of complaints, some of them almost of a whistleblowing nature, really, in scope. Why don't we talk about some of those and maybe, from the most, in your mind, the most important and down? I know that you talk about internal discrimination, illegal hiring, and no real Republicans there. What do you mean by that?
The point was not so much to be a whistleblower, and I'm certainly personally not complaining about anything, but it's that to understand the story, you have to know what went on. And the first most important thing to understand about the agency, which is really just very, very unusual, is that if it were up to them, there wouldn't be a Republican in the building. So I kind of have to tell the stories about how you got to that point, because you couldn't put on the job description Republicans need not apply. So it was kind of the process of how that happened and how they were able to keep Republicans out. And that's really the nature of why I was telling those stories. That and the fact that some of them are actually kind of funny, the way it plays out in the actual hiring meetings and things like that.
And is this what you mean when you talk about internal discrimination and illegal hiring?
There was other kinds of discrimination later on, which came out after I'd left the Bureau. There was a report that showed that their own internal employee review system, that minorities actually performed worse in the performance review system, which is under the disparate impact theory, which says you can just look at statistics alone. That would mean that they were discriminating, by their own terms and by the CFPB's own terms that they impose on the auto industry and other lenders. So that was a kind of a second step in the discrimination, was that further down the line, that internally that a lot of minority employees felt like they were being discriminated against. And it's a tough question to say whether it's intentional discrimination or whether there's just kind of cronyism going on the inside. But so, for example, I can tell you around the time all that came out, I asked one of my African-American attorney friends who was still there, well, are they really discriminating? I mean, is that possible? And he said, well, you talk about cronyism. If all the people you promote and the people you give good reviews to are your friends, and all of your friends look like you, when does that become discrimination? So it's a lot of times it's hard to draw a fine line between why something is happening. But clearly, many of the employees feel like that there was discrimination. And in fact, in the congressional hearings at that time, one of the former attorneys, who actually I had worked fairly closely with back in the day, she testified that there was an area of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau consumer response that the employees themselves nicknamed the plantation. And they did because they said, well, once you're working on the plantation, you never get off the plantation, and everybody who works in the plantation is an African-American man. So, there were some real kind of internally the employees felt like they were being discriminated against. And one of the issues was that on a numbers basis, there were the correct distribution, but the employees who were the minorities were being given the worst job, the lowest level jobs in the Bureau. So,
okay. Now, when you talk about no Republicans, it implies maybe an ideological, liberal, whatever you want to call them, a Democratic bent. Did that translate into, basically trying to extortionate and bullying of businesses?
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it was that the way the law set the agency up. First of all, you had no, political oversight, so they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And part of the law had this thing called unfair, deceptive, and abusive acts and practices, which really it left it up to the Bureau to decide what that meant. So it was very subjective. So really the Bureau could almost charge you anything they wanted. And the only thing that was kind of constraining them was their own conscience. And so when you had, over time, all of the moderates kind of left. They were kind of not wanted in one way or another. And you had, at the end, as time went on, a very singular, very left-wing view, not an intellectually diverse view of issues. And so... very
anti-business, to be blunt.
Yes. Well, somebody once said to me, someone at a bank once said, it's not that the CFPB doesn't like banks, they just think banks shouldn't make a profit.
And further, their ability to bully, you say that unlike the SEC, which had due process through Wells notices, so you knew if you were targeted, the Bureau here didn't even allow it, it sounds like, or made it very difficult to give someone a fair chance before he had to go spend huge legal bucks.
Yes, yeah, and I actually, having worked at the SEC, I actually was kind of one of the leaders in writing those processes for the CFPB because I had experience with them. So I actually wrote the internal procedures, and I knew what the rules were, which the world didn't know. And when it came time for one of my own clients to take advantage of that. They just said, no, we think it's doesn't work for us. They didn't follow their own rules. They said, well, it's discretionary. We don't have to give it to you. And we don't think it's in the Bureau's interest. And the point was, well, we're not talking about the Bureau's interest. We're talking about the defendant's interest and having a fair chance to tell their side of the story. So, yes, I mean, they at some point, and I talk about this in the article, somebody said to me, well, they set up these rules so that you didn't actually have to give the other side things that might have helped them, exculpatory evidence. And as a former prosecutor myself, I just was shocked by that. I thought, well, obviously, if you have an ethical obligation to give the other side evidence if you don't think they're guilty or you know that they're not guilty, and they didn't view themselves that way. They said, we're just like civil litigants. We're like anybody else in a lawsuit, and we don't want to give the other side things that'll
sort
help.
of like almost a rogue agency. You use the term choke points as part of them going after bigger businesses. What do you mean by that?
They would pick basically the biggest businesses to make the biggest headline, to make the biggest splash. And this was another kind of part of what ultimately disturbed me a little bit, was that they didn't choose companies because they had done the most wrong. They chose them because of who they were, because they were the biggest. And if you look at the most obvious kind of analogy, that's, if you pull somebody over driving, if a police officer pulls over someone because they're African American, you're outraged. You're saying, what do they call that? Driving while black. But when you do that to a business, when you say we're going to go after you because you're the biggest, not because you're the worst, then you're going after them because of who they are, not because of what they've done. And that, I always found that to be very disturbing.
Pretty amazing stuff. In the remaining about 30 or 40 seconds, something that always bothered me is there didn't appear to be cost-benefit analysis done in terms of that, and such as even having a business perspective to look at both sides when you went after a business.
No, it was a view of the world that didn't have that rounded perspective, because they viewed even people who were, let's say, Democrats, who had worked in private practice and represented the banks. Well, gosh, they were sympathetic to the banks or financial companies or whatever. So if you don't have those people, you also don't have their perspective and their experience and their ability to tell you why something wasn't wrong.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, final national segment with former CFPB enforcement attorney Ron Rubin next. Ron Rubin, our guest. He is the author of a long and fascinating insider take of the tragic downfall of the CFPB, as he calls it. The National Review is where the article is. Payday loans, which on the surface would seem like a perfect thing for them to go after, the 390% annualized rate for these 2-week loans that they do. But you say that the law of unintended consequences, popped up, and that CFPB may have done more damage than good.
Well, payday loans on the face of them, if you're kind of making a pitch, sound terrible. You say, well, this high interest rate, you've got people with bad credit, and you're ripping them off. But in fact, it's a perfect example of the free market and how the free market works, which is that people are not being deceived. People need those loans. People decide on their own that this is their best alternative. They don't have a chance to get a loan. Maybe they're going to have to pay overdraft fees if they don't get the loan. People know their individual circumstances. So they understand payday loans. And on top of that, there are very low barriers to entry into that business. So anybody with a little bit of money can put out a shingle and say, I'm going to do short-term loans. So there's no monopoly going on, which means that the price of the loans, if you charge too much, somebody's going to come along and charge a lower rate. So the loans are actually priced to what is, in effect, the cost, which is the risk of default and whatever it costs to kind of hang out put up a sign and have your own payday store.
And by the way, you're doing the kind of cost-benefit analysis that seemed to not exist in the rest of the agency.
Yeah, well, it's just that, and by the way, in one of my articles, Richard Corday himself testified in front of Congress and said it's a very hard business to make money in. People, even though the rates on the face of them are high, people are not gouging, because this is, given defaults and everything else it costs to offer these loans to people, this is the only way they can stay in business.
So basically, the payday loan investigation may have actually hurt the lower income folks that need it.
Yeah, so the bottom line of payday loans is if you have a better offer to make people, then sure. Then if you can figure out a way to offer loans to people at a lower interest rate, that's good. But just taking away their only source of credit without offering them something better is not helping them. And that's really kind of the problem, is that they hate the payday loans so much and they hate the idea of this high interest rate so much that they're willing to take away loans that leave people high and dry without any other source of credit.
And that leads into a good place to finish this up. What should happen to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? It seems like we have an example of a mission that had no oversight, too much power, and ended up doing a lot of damage, perhaps inadvertently, or perhaps directly as a result of the fact that they narrowed the people that they had there. So tell us what should happen to the agency and what should happen to the current director, Richard Cordray.
Congress has basically been passing bills since 2011 to change mostly two things, which is give the funding back under the control of Congress, and make this into a bipartisan commission. And every time they tried to do it, the Democrats said, you just want to harm consumer protection. You don't care about consumer protection. Those are really the two major reforms that you can look at. The question of a commission, ultimately, if you want it to be independent, ultimately it should be a commission because, well, first of all, it would have to be under the recent Court of Appeals decision. Mm-hmm. It would, if you wanted to take away the president's ability to remove members, the leaders, then it would have to be a commission, not a single director. So, ultimately...
So you think that you do not think it should be abolished?
There are real purposes for the agency. For example, one of the reasons you needed an agency like this was that the bank regulators, their first priority was always safety and soundness of the banks. And then, they didn't really focus on consumer protection. And in fact, if you think about it, higher fees, overdraft fees, even if maybe they're not so fair, mm-hmm. that kind of works in favor of safety and soundness because the banks are making more money. So there was kind of a built-in conflict of interest there, and a lot of consumer laws were not being properly enforced. First of all, it needs to be not an all-powerful, vast, overreaching bureaucracy, which is what it is, and ultimately
that's a great point at the heart of your argument. Does it need to have the consumer advocacy need to be balanced with either fairness or at least the costs to business of doing this? How do you get them to have more of a perspective that that right now it's almost like business is bad, consumers are getting screwed?
Well, the irony of it all is that a lot of the things, and if you look at most of my articles, I try not to write like, gosh, they're awful, they're bad, I don't like the agency, da-da-da. Generally, the punchline of my articles is what you're doing is actually hurting consumers. You're not even helping consumers. So, for example,
good point.
One of the things that they're working on is debt collection rules. One of the proposals that may end up becoming in the rules, or at least if the rules go through, is that the minute the debt collector calls, you can say, I never want you to call me again. That's it. I'm in control of my debt collection. And, what ends up happening? People end up getting sued because if the debt collector can't talk to you, then the next step is to sue them. Or if you can't collect on debt, what happens? Ultimately, interest rates go up because the cost has to be passed on. And so... Yeah,
that's the part that's missing, right, from the agency or the Bureau.
Well, that's economics. And in a lot of ways, economics is a difference between short-term and long-term thinking. And, so there needs to be a kind of a fuller perspective. It doesn't need to be like, I'm your class action lawyer and I'm going to just get everything I can for you today. Consumer protection doesn't mean necessarily consumer advocacy. There's a real difference there. One is law enforcement and the other is basically advocacy for your client.
Interesting. Let me ask you this. Trump is about to take over, and of course he ran The Apprentice where he issued "You're fired." Should the director, Cordray, be fired?
I don't like to see a good person be fired, whether or not they've done a good job or not.
Has he done a good job?
He's done some things well and some things not well. But, I would also say in general, I read somewhere once that nobody should ever have the same job for more than 5 years. And the director job was supposed to be a 5-year job, but because he was first recess appointed and was in a recess appointment for a year and a half, and then, before his full term came, at this point he's been almost 6 years. He's been at the agency, for 6 years, but he was nominated, was it January of 2012? So now we're coming up on 5 years. Once he was nominated, for all intents and purposes, even though he officially wasn't running the agency, he was. And then once the recess appointment was in January of 2012. So he actually has been, running things for more than 5 years.
Thanks to Ron Rubin. He's taken a very gutsy, I guess, our overall interest look at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And you could read the article in the National Review, The Tragic Downfall of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime, the nation's biggest murders, financial crimes on Wall Street, the facts, the forensics, the inside story.